Good morning. I now convene this morning's hearing entitled Where Have All the Patients Gone? Examining the Psychiatric Bed Shortage. Mr. Stern, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for hearing me today. I'm here to talk about people who are homeless with severe untreated mental illness. I've been working with homeless people for nearly 30 years. For the last 24 at Georgetown Ministry Center. Our goal back in 1990 was to put ourselves out of business by ending homelessness. Instead, homelessness has become a career for me and so many others. It has now been 10 years since cities around the country, including Washington, D.C., issued their 10-year plan to end homelessness. Not much has changed. Why is homelessness so hard to solve? From my perspective, it's because we lack the tools to intervene when a person's life has devolved to the point where he or she is moved out onto the street because of an untreated mental illness. When I began to work with the homeless population nearly 30 years ago, deinstitutionalization was in full swing. At the time, many people I was working with were cycling in and out of hospitals. The community mental health centers were trying to figure out what their role was. As deinstitutionalization has continued, I've noticed that it is increasingly harder to access beds for people in acute psychiatric crisis. In the past 2 years, I've only seen 2 people admitted to the hospital. More typically now, people referred for psychiatric crisis care get poor or no intervention and are returned to the street, almost always because they refuse treatment. Georgetown Ministry Center brings free psychiatric and medical care to the streets, but very few people with untreated mental illness are willing to engage in conversations with our psychiatrists about their mental health. It's the nature of the illness. However, when we talk about a shortage of beds for treatment, we are not talking about the people I work with, because these people with limited or no insight into their illness don't think they need treatment and vehemently refuse treatment when it is offered. Homeless people are real people with families like yours and mine, families that care. Greg is someone I met sitting on a park bench near our center. He was shabbily dressed and smelled bad. He would drink, I assume, to tame the voices that I knew he heard because of the frequent spontaneous smiles and grimaces. All this belied the fact that Greg was once a gifted constitutional lawyer who delighted his children with his dry wit. They were in their late teens when he began to show the signs of what would become a profoundly disabling bipolar disorder. Not long after, he disappeared. He would call occasionally on birthdays or out of the blue for no reason. The kids tried so hard to keep up with him. They wanted desperately to make him whole again, but it was futile. Greg drifted from city to city around the country, ending up in our center, ultimately in our small shelter one winter 8 years ago. Greg was a delight some of the time. His thick southern drawl and witty conversation would enchant volunteers, but other times he was withdrawn and surly. In January of 2006, Greg became sick. We encouraged him to go to the hospital, and he said that he would. Instead, he disappeared. A week later, I received a call from the medical examiner's office. They needed a body identified. It was Greg. The bodies never looked the way you remember a person. Only Greg's face and hair showed from the white shroud covering his body. It took a few moments to work out that these were the features of the person that I once knew. A few years later, I met Greg's 2 adult children. They had learned he had died in Washington 3 years after the fact. Each of them traveled, one from New York, the other from Phoenix, to meet here and see the place where their dad spent his final days. They needed to know what his last days were like. I shared coffee with them, and they told stories about him, and they asked questions about his final days. They laughed and they cried. You could tell that they loved and missed their father. There are so many stories I could tell if I had time, about mothers, brothers, sons, daughters who have wept for their relatives lost to mental illness. If the families had the tools to intervene, they would intervene. Most of all, what I want to impart here is that people who live on the street are real people with families and hopes and dreams abandoned because of an illness that has robbed them of their competency. The other important takeaway is that almost all of the people I see on the street are there because they have refused treatment, not for rational reason, but because illness has insidiously robbed them of their insight to understand that they have an illness and that treatment can help them. So finally, what I've concluded after nearly 30 years of working with people who are homeless is that all I can do is provide some comfort and harm reduction. Until we are given tools for more assertive interventions, we will not resolve homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stern.